Okay, well, I think we'll get started now. We're just at over 200 participants that have joined us today. So I really just wanted to say good afternoon to you, to our alumni, to our students, to our friends and our community members, and really just to welcome you to the second Alumni Speaker Series session of 2021. My name is Mary Wells, and I feel so proud and privileged to be the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering. And so today, our panel of experts from academia and industry are looking at the very timely issue of what healthy cities could look like in the future. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say and what their views on this are. These experts will examine where architecture and city design are headed, considering our current great social upheaval of the pandemic and other considerations such as our aging population. As they think about these considerations in their work in architectural designs, they will attempt to answer questions such as, what does it mean to be a healthy city? How close are we to living sustainably in urban environments? Will the pandemic and rise of working from home affect how we design city life and civic spaces now and in the future? And what does an age-friendly city look like over the next couple of decades? So it sounds like it's going to be a really timely session and some very, very interesting questions. Today's session is being moderated by Professor Anne Bordelot, who is the O'Donovan Director of the School of Architecture here at the University of Waterloo. As always, we welcome your questions and will answer as many as we can in this session. I know I am really excited about learning more about the future of healthy cities, and I will now pass it over to Anne to be your moderator.
Right. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you also for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all here. As Mary said, I'm professor and director of the School of Architecture. I'm an architect and a historian. I should also say that I'm no expert actually in healthy or smart cities, but I'm really excited to have panelists here today who can offer some great insights into what we've sort of entitled Reimagining Healthy Cities. So before I introduce them, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on YouTube for viewing. So the link will be of the recording will be sent to everyone after the sessions in the coming days. And also just to invite you to enter questions into the Q&A section, and we'll answer those questions as the event progresses. So I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we may be calling in from different locations today, I'm currently at the School of Architecture, which is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is located on the Alderman Track, which is land promised to the Six Nations that include 6 miles or 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. And this land acknowledgement might also be something that we have in mind when we think about healthy cities. And here we might refer to the architect Douglas Cardinal's definition of architecture as mediating relationships between people or peoples, and also between them and the natural world. This includes fostering harmonious relationships to the land, and understanding and acknowledging the history of that land is one facet of this ambition. So now let me just introduce our panelist, Jonathan Entz, who's a graduate of the Waterloo Architecture Program in 2007. He is a designer and assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, where he now teaches courses at the School of Architecture, but also with the new Architectural Engineering program. He is a graduate of Princeton School of Architecture MArch's program, where he was awarded the Susan Coleridge Prize, Henry Adams Medal, and the Butler Traveling Fellowship. His teaching and research is dedicated at developing tools, systems, and structures that begin with a methodological observation of human behavior in the built environment so that he can support a vision for grassroots or emergent design. Jonathan also runs Humanix Lab at the University of Waterloo. This is a research and design group dedicated to building tools, again, to enable this bottom-up building design by non-experts. Recent work from the lab includes development of tactile interfaces to allow sort of novices or beginners to configure custom floor plans, but also a partnership with Toronto Health Networks to envision strategies that encourage self-organization of healthy, grassroots, vertical, aging communities. Jonathan also runs an applied design office named Eng's Design Office, or EDO. Nusha Gaeli is president and co-founder of BioBot Analytics, which is the first company in the world that was bringing wastewater epidemiology to market. BioBot's customers include federal, state, and local governments, top companies, as well as international aid organizations. In North America alone, BioBot has worked with over 500 communities, generating data to help better track and manage COVID-19. Prior to founding BioBot, Nusha was an urban design studies researcher, exploring the application of technologies in urban systems to build more responsive and resilient cities. She was a research fellow at the MIT Sensible Cities Lab and an instructor in the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. So she's trained as an architect. She has an undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture from the University of Waterloo and McGill University. And as an architect, she has collaborated with the World Economic Forum's Council on the Future of Cities, the UN Climate Change Summit, the US Department of Energy, and US territorial governments on the design of coastal resilient communities. In 2020, she was a recipient of the University of Waterloo's Faculty of Engineering Young Alumni Achievement Medal, well-deserved. Congratulations. Sarah Gunawan is also a Waterloo Architecture alum, and since June 2019, she has been a senior designer at Co-Adaptive Architecture, which is a Brooklyn-based practice that focuses on evolving existing buildings to create future resilient environments. Her independent research and work entangle multi-species cohabitation, feminist disability studies, misfitting human bodies, and post-human theory, all in an effort to stay with the trouble. She was the Rainer Banham Fellow 2017-2018 at the University of Buffalo, where her teaching and research focused on disrupting normative practice or design processes through the lens of human aging. She's also an active member of Designers as Protest, which is a coalition of designers mobilizing strategies to dismantle the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as tools of oppression. And our last panelist is Maya Trubilsky, who's an associate professor and also associate director undergraduate studies at the School of Architecture of the University of Waterloo, where she co-founded the Data Lab group. She has a dual background in architecture and computer science, and through this sort of a foot in both worlds, so to say, she explores how the increased availability of data, but also the emergence of computational design, transforms the theoretical frameworks, the methodologies, the tools, and outcomes of the architect. For a number of years now, her research has been focusing on what she calls soft materials, which is a project through which she's developing architecture-specific methods for achieving more complete engagement with both the socio-cultural agency, but also the technical capacity of the computational components that are more and more embedded within data-driven design work. So the goal here is to bridge technological and socio-cultural concerns. So welcome. Thank you for all panelists for joining us. And let's jump into our topic. Health or reimagining healthy cities. And maybe the first thing I will say is when we think about health in cities, this is not a new conversation. We can think of health reforms in Victorian times in Britain, when to vent or flush the house properly became pretty much a medical concern. And there was a consideration that the air that we were breathing could be poisonous and filled with germs. Or we can look at responses to the Spanish flu earlier this century, or even the argument by the architectural historian Beatriz Colomina that modernism as a movement was characterized by a desire to actually sanitize architecture, implementing in homes what an architect like Alvar Aalto first did in a sanatorium in response to tuberculosis. But green cities, zoning, greening of the streets, these are all shifts or responses in architecture and urban design that have been motivated by finding health or perhaps a new balance amidst increased production, density and movement. So recently, this is of course augmented by our ability to gather data for sentient and responsive cities, to work with this information and tracking it not only from the city streets and infrastructure, but also from the people that move through the cities. Sometimes it's about them, their health. Sometimes it's about their environment. So smart cities can manage how things flow and respond to these flows as they increase or decrease. So people, germs, cars. And this brings both some incredibly powerful opportunities, but also some risks. And today, I guess we'll try to touch on both the possible successes and potential shortcomings. So when we say healthy cities, or we entitled this session Reimagining Healthy Cities, we're also, of course, thinking that cities must get smarter, but we didn't really use the term smart. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of this was that we wanted to speak to the intentions to create, these healthy and sustainable urban environments, and foreground those intentions and ambitions rather than just stay with the use of smart or the use of technology in and of itself, which is what smart cities often make us think of. So I guess the first question I'd like to pose to our panelists is, what do we mean when we say healthy cities? And what are the potential shortcomings of simply talking about smart cities? In response to this notion of the technology-driven or ambition of becoming healthy. So Maya, can I go to you first?
Sure, of course. Hi, everybody. I think it would be useful to elaborate a little bit more on why this group is likely uncomfortable or has at least a little bit of discomfort with the term smart city. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that smart cities have really become predominantly associated with kind of top-down, large-scale corporate-led implementations of smartness. So for things like this, you could think of Songdo City in South Korea that was basically developed by Cisco. Or you could think of, in your imagination, like city control rooms, maybe like IBM's control room for Rio de Janeiro. And so for these kinds of smart cities, which are kind of what come to mind for many people, it's important to kind of realize that they're highly tuned to the kind of notion of performance, which is really characterized in these instances as things that can be kind of measured relatively easily and quantitatively. So notions of efficiency, economy, and optimization as can be measured. Sensors monitoring traffic flow, as you already spoke to, and monitoring energy consumption, things that are kind of recordable and easily analyzed. Of course, those are like super meaningful instruments to fulfill the promise of the smart city. But I think it's important, definitely from my perspective, and I'm sure for others in the group, that we can't limit ourselves to that notion of smartness. And so you've alluded to, like within the architecture community, there's some alternative terms that are used to maybe speak to this idea of kind of hybrid environments mediated by technology and the built world together. So things like the responsive city, the sentient city, the real-time city, among a few others. And I think what's important about these kind of reframings of that idea is that they're really kind of trying to maintain a broader set of values and outcomes. So obviously sometimes foregrounding citizens, foregrounding participation, foregrounding time, things like that. And they're struggling and working towards finding smart city ideas beyond merely technologically supported optimization. There's one that I particularly like, an alternative term, and it comes from Ben Green, who advocates for the idea of like a smart enough city. And through this kind of idea, he very much warns against technologically focused lenses to envision urban futures. His argument kind of goes on to say that as long as we think of optimization and efficiency as defining the project of the smart city, will likely inevitably produce inequities, bias, breaches of privacy, and other attacks on social values. And this argument is stemmed from something that I think from an architecture perspective, we really recognize that the built environment, the urban environment, is incredibly complex. And often the things that are hard to measure are the things to pay attention to. And I think maybe to kind of ground this idea in an example, I think there's one useful one that I use quite a lot, and that's as a kind of cautionary tale maybe, when things were too simplified or too quickly moved to technology being the answer, or at least a kind of enabler of something. And that's an earlier version of the City of Boston's street bump app. So City of Boston came up with this idea, seemed great, that people would just have the app on their phone, move around the city, and through a kind of measurement, listening of the accelerometer on the phone, and the kind of geospatial occurrence of those things overlapping, they would be able to hunt out where potholes existed in the city, and then automatically kind of send out the crews to fix those. So rather than calling your 311 number or actually like ground truthing exercises, they would rely on the app to do that. And so this was a great idea. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people signed up and downloaded the app. But this app had like a kind of glaring signal problem. And it became apparent very quickly that the people who could run this app on their phone, who maybe had smartphones, or maybe had the data plan to support basically streaming information nonstop to this municipality, they were a certain type of people, and they weren't the same type of people from other communities. And so all of a sudden, the potholes in more affluent communities, more road-based communities got filled. And actually the app actually ended up almost diverting services away from a more needy group to this new group that was now kind of pumping the information and the data. So this was clearly an example of where like the physical world, the complexity of the physical world wasn't captured in the logic of the technology. And I think for me, thinking about smart cities and healthy cities, I think we have lots of work like the Street Bump app to do, especially as architects. And I think as long as the city is kind of permeated increasingly with these kind of smart projects, hybrid projects, often unchecked for these kinds of effects like the Street Bump app, it's unlikely that we're building healthy cities relying on this technology on its own.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, I mean, the question of like who's actually maybe not seen when we're implementing some of this technology and just keeping our eyes on that. I think, I mean, one of the other, question that as asked, or maybe some of the misconceptions around smart cities that in some cases, like these are envisioned as sort of like new types of cities, or they're like their whole new neighborhoods are developed, or a piece of land that is acquired, like to develop like a sort of implement smart systems. But in fact, you know, smarter is often also about recognizing opportunities that exist and that are already there within the urban infrastructure. And I guess, I mean, Yusha, turning to you, like BioBot is precisely doing this, like it's leveraging current components of our cities. And do you want to speak to this a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, our cities represent a collective history that spans generations. So it's just simply unrealistic to think that as a society, we're going to pack up and we're going to move somewhere else. We're not going to rebuild London or New York or Tokyo. And so what's important when thinking about building responsive and resilient cities is exactly what you said, and is identifying opportunities in our urban systems. And I think that advancements in technology are affording us to identify opportunities that we weren't able to previously. You know, increased sensing power, increased computing power, passive data generation. These are all advancements in the last few decades that are really pushing the boundaries of what we can respond to. But we need to be mindful about how we implement them. We need to take human-centered and problem-focused approaches. And I hope that that's something that, you know, we've done at BioBot. This work started as a research collaboration between myself when I was at MIT and my now co-founder, who's a biologist, a microbiologist. And when we came together, it was just a research question, an explorative, you know, project about whether we could look at our sewer systems as being analogous to the human gut. So in the same way that we can tell a lot about a person by sampling their microbiome, what can we learn about a community or a population by sampling a city's sewer system? And it started as just an exploratory project and continued that way for a few years. But over time, we started to get input from city officials, government officials, curious about what our data was saying and asking us, actually pointing us towards sort of questions that they were having trouble answering with existing technologies that they had access to. And the more and more feedback we collected, the more we realized that there's actually an opportunity here for us to address some existing, urban challenges that otherwise are going unanswered. And so that was really the impetus for us to turn this research project into a company and actually bring the technology to market. So yeah, I just want to underscore, I think it's really important for us to kind of reframe a little bit our thinking of these smart cities or these technologically powered cities as being not kind of brand new developments from the ground up, or I've heard people say from the internet up, but rather it's about embedding technology in our existing urban infrastructures.
I think it's really interesting also, like, there was the analogy of the, like the Victorian times was like kind of the home was like a body, and then you look at how it was breathing, and then now it's the cities kind of like a body, like I think in terms of how you've approached it. But I think it's also interesting to think that, when we think about sensors, I think we have this notion like these are like these devices that we tap, but in the end, like the sewage, in the end, like this is the sensor, like it's already there, and then you just need to analyze it and, pick it up, I guess, pick samples. But I think, the other question is also, and we'll go back to that notion of scale, but I think the other question in terms of the smart city, which Maya touched on, was in terms of like who's included. Like maybe there's this idea of like the public is like this young technologically savvy group in a high-tech city that is managed through data, with movement and pollution sensors, driverless vehicles, all powered by renewable energy, like this sort of like maybe that's from the internet up type of thing. But I think healthy cities, or perhaps, when we talk about a healthy living environment, I think we're trying to also imply a much broader range of concerns and also stakeholders like young, old, rich, poor, human, non-human. And I don't know if Jonathan, so much of your work is about empowering or bottom up, or but also aging populations. Do you want to expand on this broadened public and who the participants might be?
Sure. And I think you're right. I think there's an association with, when you hear smart, even just the word smart conjures an association with kind of young, affluent, tech-focused folks. And I think what's really, really exciting is to take a more realistic view, and to also ask how those other demographics are engaging and are being engaged by technology. So, I also have a little bit of the skepticism that Maya talked about earlier in and around the question of smart, but only because I'm super obsessed with the question of what knowledge is in general in architecture. What do we know? How do we know it? And then how do we act on it? And I think those are really important questions for all the projects in the smart city. So one of the questions I've been looking at is to try to study and understand the phenomena of aging in urban centers, and to ask what the future of aging is as it inevitably becomes vertical in urban centers. And I think that there's really, really exciting areas of work that I try to tell my students that it's exciting to engage with older folks. I think there's more and more people becoming interested in this field. And I think for too long, we've kind of left these really important questions to become kind of institutionalized, whether it's the schools or the old age homes. And I think, this is an area that I think is going to be really exciting when we cross it with some of the technological, but also some of the kind of robust problem framing methods that I think underlie the smart development. And so there definitely is a very broad population that's going to be benefited by the smart city. And I think a lot of really particular solutions that have to be looked at in terms of aging. And I think it actually is a really rather than it's actually a kind of hot field. And that's what I've been excited to unfold. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about some of that a little later.
No, and I think, the other thing that you just mentioned, yes, aging and population, the kind of what does vertical aging mean in our cities? But I think that it's interesting because you go back a lot to problem, how we frame the problem. And maybe that's another dimension where sometimes, it's beyond trying to find a sort of a focused, a focused solutions. It's not about isolating something and finding a solution, irrespective of everything else that's happening, but often is really trying to really think much more holistically about the context and ultimately identifying issues and problems and reframing those, and then finding ways of actually engaging with them as they are reframed. So shifting lens through scales or across groups of stakeholders becomes really important. So maybe turning to Sarah, because I think in your work, what's interesting as well, and then certainly as it started here at the school through your master's thesis, was actually looking at things that we called problems and trying to look, actually reframe, in this case, like the urban or suburban pests as actually positive agents. And do you want to speak, to that, but also other considerations in terms of broadening, who we're talking about when we look at participants?
Mm-hmm. Mostly when we think of healthy cities and smart cities, it's from
it seems to have just froze.
Uh-oh.
Possibly.
Am I here? Can you hear me? We're good? Okay. So when we think of smart cities and healthy cities, it's often from a human-centric lens, but humans are not the only living inhabitants of cities. And so cities are often placed in opposition to wilderness, but in fact are already really vibrant plant and animal populations that live within our urban ecosystems. The trouble is that we often define these plants and animals as problems, as Anne alluded to, as weeds that we need to pull out or mow down and eliminate from landscapes and buildings. And so I would argue that we need to reframe our conceptions of nature within cities so that the species that are present, the ones that are really well adapted to living alongside humans, so the squirrels and the raccoons and the house sparrows, which are called synanthropes, are considered citizens, considered part of the urban environment. But I would then ask, if we extended that same logic to say, what if we designed cities to welcome a diverse range of plant, insect, and animal life that might not be as readily adapted to the urban environment? So I think there's a role for design and architecture to play in trying to welcome in new species into the urban environment, especially in a context of the climate crisis and the rising extinction of animal species around the world. Did we lose Anne?
So you lost me, and I think I'm back just as you conclude your answer. So I won't be able to pick up on what you just said, but I'm glad the timing worked out well. Of course, this is the day where I lose the internet, but I'll have to catch up with you later. But sorry, maybe I'll continue with you then, Sarah. And sorry, I can't speak to what you've just talked about, and maybe shifting to a next set of questions around how the pandemic, how the conditions that we've been facing over the past year, how is that? One of the questions, like the rise from working from home or the conditions that we've seen, how that might impact how we design city life and civic spaces now or in the future. And I think maybe in tackling this, it's also talking about what the pandemic has really brought to light in a way that cannot really be ignored, both generally, but also in relation to how that might impact how we think of architecture's role in this. And actually, I don't know if Sarah, you've talked about this already, but in your introduction or your bio, you mentioned, or you refer to the scholar Donna Haraway, her plea for us to stay with the trouble. And apologies, everyone, if you touched on this, but if you have not, can you expand a bit on this and what she and you mean by this?
Certainly. So in Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, the subtitle is Making Kin in the Truthocene. She posits that we are living in really disturbing times. And I mean, she wrote this book in 2013, and so probably could not have even foreseen what has happened in the last year. But that in these disturbing times, we really need to make trouble, to stir things up, and to within the kind of present condition that we are experiencing. And I think that idea is really prescient in this moment that we're living through. We have a global pandemic, which is intersecting with and exacerbating the effects of climate crisis, of rising socioeconomic inequality, and a really long history of racism and discrimination. And so similar to the civil rights activist John Lewis's call to make good trouble, necessary trouble, we as architects and designers need to kind of disrupt the status quo, to challenge the systems and structures that really have led us here. And part of that process, Donna Haraway argues, is learning how to live with each other. We can no longer divide ourselves across lines of us versus them, of citizen versus alien, and of human versus non-human, and the many other binary concepts that we construct. And so instead, she argues that we need to understand the entanglements between all the inhabitants of our planet and build collaborative relationships to work together if we want to keep going on living and thriving on planet Earth. And so within the pandemic, I would say it has made it very clear the deep interconnections between viruses, bacteria, plants, animals, humans, all living together interdependently in cities across the planet. The condition we're all in now is that the poor health of an animal species led to the viral spread that ultimately led to resulting poor health of humans around the world. And so we are really very closely entangled. And so as a result, I think in our day-to-day lives, we've become increasingly aware of the ecologies of our interior environments, who we're sharing our spaces with, what kind of preconditions they bring into those spaces, also sort of cohabitation with non-humans. Many people have adopted pets in these times in place for human companionship. And then ultimately, the other side of that is what exposures might emerge from being within these spaces. What risks are we willing to take to be together? And I would say that beyond the fear that comes with that, I think there's also a deep understanding of the value of interrelations to our human well-being, how much we need to be connected to each other, not just across video screens, but in physical space. And so I'm excited to see kind of what happens with that valuing and realization of the importance of those conditions.
No, thank you. And I mean, maybe anecdotally, or maybe because I'm at the school now, like really what the students are missing classes and everything, but I think the spaces that they really miss are like the corridors, or, like the hallways, the atrium, like these spaces of informal relations and interaction. So the space that actually are sort of around what we design typically, like around the program space, that become really critical. Nusha, what are some of the issues that have come to the fore for you and that you've been tackling in your work? I mean, through this pandemic or even prior, and as you think about the future?
Yeah, so when we first started the company and sort of decided to take that leap from academia and actually commercialize the technology, our vision, or the reason why we did this, is because we believed that sewage presented a huge opportunity for us to better understand human health and behavior, and therefore better respond to human health challenges. Our mission in 2017, when we started the company, was, and it still is, to leverage data from sewage to make community health more proactive and more equitable. And the reason why I say equitable is because neither myself nor my co-founder came from public health, but the more we started to learn about how public health resources are distributed in our cities, we found that it's not, the resource allocation is not equal across all inhabitants of our cities. Now, this might be unique a little bit to the United States where we're based, but decisions around resources tend to skew towards people who have health insurance, towards people who are interacting more frequently with the healthcare system. Whereas we felt everybody has a voice in our sewer systems. And so it really presented an opportunity for us to develop resources for everyone equally. Everybody's voice is equally considered and weighted in our wastewater systems, in our sewer systems. And so we can design services that equally and best represent a community's population. Now, believe it or not, when we started the company, this vision was not widely shared. When we were talking to government officials, investors, as a startup talking to investors, it was a very contrarian thing to really be talking about, that we should be leveraging data to more equitably deploy public health resources. And so I think one thing that this pandemic has done, and I think if there's one good thing that comes from 2020, is that it's really exposed a lot of these health inequities and disparities. We saw it with clinical testing distribution. We saw it with how certain communities were adversely impacted by COVID-19 and had, not the same access to tests, but we're also seeing it still in vaccination rollouts and how it's not equally made available to all communities. Again, I'm speaking from experience being in the United States. And so I think that's one thing that's really changed for us in this past year, is that our vision is a lot more shared, and there's a lot more buy-in into the need to build health resilience in our communities.
Yeah, thanks. And unfortunately, it's not just limited to the United States, although, that's a very specific lens. But I mean, you see it across countries, but also internationally in how distribution is handled. But it's kind of, there's a paradox, because of course, health will really come when everyone, as we've seen, everything is so interdependent and interrelated that, health really is only achieved by all, having access to this. I think differently, Jonathan, you're also interested in, what might lie in the shadow, or challenging, maybe not so much existing power structures, but empowering different players through your work. You speak of grassroots or emergent design. What do you see more clearly through the lens of the pandemic, and how do you think that might transform our roles as architects? Simple question.
Yeah, simple question. I think, in one word, I think one trend that we can see out of the pandemic that relates to cities and relates to human-centered design is a trend towards decentralization. I think, you think across many industries, but you think about our industry, education, and all of the other services and sectors that have been forced to decentralize. It's kind of something that others have written about previous to this, when thinking about how ideas like fabrication could become, the making of parts, the making of cars, the making of things could become more decentralized. So rather than happening in one spot, that trying to link this back to the city would need to define as a large scale industrial zone, decentralization would allow things to be made in multiple places in smaller scales and then brought together. And I think it's kind of what we're seeing. Part of that is fantasy, but part of it is actually, I think, happening. And I think that's what you certainly see with some of the service sectors through the pandemic. You've seen decentralization happen. You've seen the decentralization of education, of teaching, of all kinds of other things. And I think there's probably scary parts to that, but I'm focused on the exciting parts. I think that it kind of reinforces maybe a belief that some agency can be downloaded towards people or towards smaller scales, like the home. And I think that there's an interesting overlap between the themes of the city and urbanization and decentralization. If I live in the rural, out in the boonies, and we're fully decentralized, and I'm making, let's say we've figured out how to make, I don't know, some simple mechanical instrument, and I work in my own small factory and make just the rubber, and someone else makes another part. You know, you really need the city to bring these networks together and make exchange more possible. So there's actually, I think, a link between decentralization and the importance of urban centers. And so I think that the last year has shown a movement towards that, at least in terms of what we can do in the service sector. And I'm really interested in how other services can start to decentralize. And we've been looking at healthcare services, you know, just from a spatial perspective. And you might think, well, how the heck does service and space relate? But just think of if anyone remembers like Consumers Distributing, where it was a store whose spatial design was basically the idea of a single desk that you go up to and say, I would like this part in this catalog, and someone would go get it. You know, there's always a link between the delivery of services and the design of an efficient space. You can even think of a fast food store and how linked to the services to the design of the space. And so I think actually there's a big impact that decentralization is going to have in the smart city. And it's going to change how we think about the design of spaces. And I think one exciting place to look at is also the decentralization of health services, of parts of emergency rooms, of the question of getting sick at home rather than getting sick in a hospital, and how you bring people to your house and how people can kind of access. I think that, you know, the last year has just shown some of the trends that can happen at the very beginning of that kind of evolution.
Yeah, I'm seeing like, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and maybe I'll ask you a quick question to Maya, and then we'll go into like, you know, what, like re-envisioning our roles as well. But Maya, like in the first question, you talked about the Boston's street bump app and the kind of limits of that, but also like in relation to the sort of the inequities and what we have to think about. And, you know, so as we, you know, Sarah was also talking, referring to it as well as Nusha, but that the pandemic is also further exacerbating those existing inequities. Like, what do you see the role that we can play as architects to bridge these gaps and making sure, at the same time, making sure that we stay with the trouble?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll speak like from a point of view that really recognizes that as the digital and physical components become kind of increasingly bundled together in our environment, I do think that architects are incredibly well positioned to play a key role in understanding and managing the effects of those entanglements. Entanglement seems to be the word of the day. So I think like as a discipline, we have a very mature and robust practice of reading the built world from multiple perspectives, from a technical perspective, from social, cultural perspectives, political, increasingly ecological and ethical. And we have a practice of kind of multidimensional frames to reflect on our projects. So we understand impacts on occupants directly, we understand impacts on neighborhoods, environments. And in short, we really acknowledge as a discipline that we are in fact responsible for creating a built environment that's actually capable of enhancing some values and actually downplaying and rejecting others. And that's a really sort of scary place to be sometimes as a discipline, but I think we as a discipline have worked hard to maintain that kind of multi-perspective approach. And so I think, I guess I really do think that the newcomers to like the kind of city builders, so like the newcomers being like tech companies and software service providers and things like that, they don't come with that mature practice of seeing the city or seeing their domain through these lenses. And so I guess, and I think they're recognizing that it's really important. In my research, I read a lot about how like tech companies evaluate their work in relationship to some of these questions, and it's a very very kind of baby steps process still for them. And so I guess to stay with the trouble, I think we really should as a discipline see ourselves as a kind of nexus for addressing these considerations and making sure that they get voiced, not only in the physical domain, which we're continuously doing and trying to get better at, but increasingly in this kind of strange virtual domain that's also playing a role in our built world. This, of course, points to a whole bunch of new things that we would have to do as a discipline. I advocate for like a kind of critical computational literacy, where we learn to kind of read and manage the invisible components of our projects with as much care and practice as we do the physical ones. And so that can extend to considerations around things like representation. So who's authoring these invisible components? What kind of bias do they bring? Of course, the kind of issue of data is loaded also with questions that we need to ask. So, you know, why was it made? Who's it made for? How is it formatted? Is it accessible? Is it useful? What is its quality? And then, of course, the last one is the algorithms themselves that can kind of define these invisible components need to be kind of thoroughly understood in the same ways we understand how a glass wall makes a building more transparent and inviting.
You know, I'm listening as I'm scanning some of the questions that are coming in and trying to determine which to go to. There were a couple of images of the work that you each do also that was speaking to the kind of the roles that we can take in a way, like imagining, but also literally imaging or showing these relationships and drawing attention to them. And maybe there's a way of going to that. But I mean, one of the questions, which I think you're partly touching on, Maya, when you're talking about like, you know, what do we need? What skills do we need to do this? Like these approach, you know, that healthy cities will necessitate participatory, science-informed, or ecological approaches to design. And do you think these approaches to design or design methodologies are adequately addressed in contemporary architectural education? Like, what are some of the changes that we need to implement in terms of how we educate future architects? Or what are the things that we do that in fact prepares them? So I think you spoke to a little bit of this. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. I'll open it up in this way.
I mean, I would say the educate, like just very quickly, because I'm aware of the time too, that I would just advocate for continuously valuing these entanglements, right? Whether they're like it's learning how to do something technologically on its own is really important, but we want to kind of continuously be questioning it in terms of its impact, in terms of the ripples that it has for other things. And I think that's a big part of architectural education that is part of the culture, but I think now it needs to be expanded to, I think other kind of like subcultures that are emerging and present in the school.
I mean, I wonder if, and I'll try to go to another question also, because they are coming in like around, like, I think some of the things that we talked about, like, you know, sort of polycenters or, you know, cities away from cities and both like dependencies, but also independence. And what does that look like in the future? Can I just show, I think there are a couple of slides as well that can start to show some of the work that you're each doing, thinking about what do these cities look like? And I think, Jonathan, this slide is some of your work looking at vertical, aging. Do you want to speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, I should just say quickly, this is work that I did in partnership with University Health Network. They have a lab called Open Lab that investigates healthcare futures, but they're really interested in what we're interested in, which is defining problems. So we were just asked to help them look at the phenomena of vertical aging, which is a massive phenomena in the GTA. And we were looking at what the kind of physical implications of vertical aging are. Where are old folks aging? What are these buildings? What are their qualities? What are their spatial qualities? And so we always start with understanding the problem first. So on the left, you're seeing the blue building, which is actually a kind of Mr. Potato Head diagram of what the average building looks like. So, you know, this is what most seniors are aging in Toronto, and these are its qualities. And then we move on to typically in a job, in one of these consulting jobs, we would move on to then thinking about solutions. So on the right, we have what we called one of the social corridors, which was a series of ideas that started to address opportunities we found in studying these buildings and trying to fix the challenge of pro-social, finding spaces where seniors can develop better, more robust social connections.
And I wonder if we go, I think, I think some of the other slides, Maya, this is some of your work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, just being quick here, I think like one thing that I alluded to was that I'm advocating for a kind of computational literacy. And for me, what I think kind of adds agency to designers is actually to start to think about a project's material kind of constitution or assembly as including physical things, but also increasingly these non-physical things. And so this is just an example of, I often kind of, a big part of my research right now is taking projects that are developed by architects to kind of operate in the kind of smart city world. And I kind of study them and I take them apart. I do these kind of anatomical or biopsies or autopsies or whatever you want to think of them, and really break them apart, and not only from a material perspective to show these entanglements again, but also starting to think about how different stakeholders, so speaking to some of Sarah's comments, non-humans in this case are relevant and things like that, and also in that middle orange bar starting to think about how kind of the agencies that the projects affords to different groups or not. And so that's just an example of that. I could spend 25 minutes explaining it, but I'll skip it for now.
And I don't know, actually, I forget some of the other works. I think there was some, is this Nusha? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I had just included this to sort of show the audience and start us thinking about, the potential power if we start tapping into some of these opportunities. So here, what you're looking at is a plot of just 50 of the communities that we work with in the US, where we've been sampling wastewater, measuring COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, rather, the virus, for at least 6 months, if not longer. In blue, you see the wastewater data trending over time, and in orange, you see the new clinical cases reported in that community. And what you can see is that the data actually tracks very, very well. So now imagine if this was, or something like this was our trigger, passive data collection was the trigger for an early warning for pandemic versus relying on people to opt into, going and getting tested. And if you actually flip to the next slide, you can actually see that it also tracks geographically. So this is a heat map of those same 50 communities in the states that they're in from April through November. In blue is the concentration of the virus in wastewater, and in orange is the new cases. And you can see that almost it's the exact same states that rise to the top each month. Now imagine if as a city official, you had a map like this for your community and how you can start diverting and directing resources to actually impact the communities that need access to those resources.
No, and I think in a way, like this sort of representational roles or imaging roles that we have as architects is like critical, right? Like in a way, like sort of showing the data and mapping it and tracing it. And I don't know if actually the other slides some of those are relating to more of, I mean, this is a quick project. I don't know if Maya, you want to speak to this or if we super briefly. Yeah.
I guess it's just a good opportunity to remember how good architects are at already playing a role in shaping the city. And I think the kind of Pam McConnell Aquatic Center by MJM in Toronto is a kind of incredibly potent example of where architects sort of reinterpret or challenge ideas of things like accessibility, equity, diversity, not to meet the building code, but to kind of transcend the potentials of something in a place. And so here, for example, there's like a lot of innovation around how the change rooms work to make them universal, which at first glance seems maybe limiting, but it actually is incredibly enabling for mothers to take larger families. This is in a lower income area of the city where there's a very diverse group of people living and a large Muslim population. And so there's a lot of traditions that are captured here. And similarly, beyond the change room idea, there's this incredible idea around the kind of the facade of the building, which is glazed and kind of to be dynamic and inviting for the community. But then, of course, Muslim women can't use that during the because they can't be seen bathing. And so all of a sudden, they could have been relegated to some back corner swimming pool, but instead the architects actually kind of placed that need centrally, and they kind of have invented a kind of dynamic facade system that protects, that changes this thing from a transparent box to a secluded oasis. And so I think like that's the kind of spirit that I think can be brought to all of these elements of the kind of smartness and healthiness, where we kind of go beyond just meeting code and meeting expectations, but using our design skills to be innovators in that space.
I think Sarah, and you spoke a little bit about this, but I think there are a couple of more slides that actually also was showing at the level, and maybe we'll shift unless Jonathan, you have like one quick comment here on the humans as sensors, and then we go to Sarah. I'm trying to wrap up in 2 minutes here.
Well, these are just, I think, important. I mean, following on Maya's, connecting the dots between smart and the design of the built environment. There are ideas that our discipline's been talking about. Industrial design and Don Norman, but also Stuart Brand and how buildings learn. It's invested in the idea of what intelligence is. And I just also say, this is my pitch for studying humans as well, that humans are really good sensors. And I think that if there's one thing architects have to get better at, it's talking to regular everyday people and not just talking to ourselves. And so here's an example of great projects in Japan, Kikutake Sky House, already in 1958, studying the idea of change over time and trying to understand how families change, what people need. So this is kind of all encompassing in terms of a set of graphics of things I think are very important.
So maybe from humans to non-humans and non-humans, Sarah.
Mm-hmm. Every building project that we do is situated within a complex human and more than human ecology. And so I advocate for taking that as a starting point, thinking about how we as humans relate to the species that are around us, and use that as a place to begin any architectural project. So this is a thesis work that I did while as a master's student at the University of Waterloo. These are drawings looking at the complex relationship between raccoons and humans in the city of Toronto largely, but also the behaviors of chimney swifts. The next slide looks at an idea of saying, how do we restructure that relationship from the green bin, which is this sort of industrial design component, to something that is a more architectural and connected to the house, and that's a compost chimney that aerates, or essentially that homeowners can place food waste into and engage raccoons in an idea of aeration of that compost in exchange for some amount of food waste or nourishment for them. But really the important part is, how does an idea like that, something small like a chimney, when multiplied across the landscape of a suburb, which is already highly standardized, change the landscape? And so that compost, instead of a fence, becomes a place for growing plant matter and plant life. And if we go to the next slide, thinking about how that extends across the backyards of a whole suburban block, and even between houses to create vegetation as a privacy screen. And then on the next slide, thinking about how that small idea, when multiplied across a whole landscape, can have a sort of positive impact on the ecology as well of that place, but also restructure human and animal relationships. So this is actually in Markham area, thinking about how these actions could reinforce the existing waterways and treed areas in that neighborhood. And instead of calling our neighborhoods Oak Ridge, despite the fact that all the oak trees have been removed, why could we actually cultivate specific ecologies within the neighborhoods that we create?
So again, responding to the kind of different actors that are already present, and without sort of categorizing them, like without prejudice in a way, like prejudgment. Can I mean, I know we're at time, but the person that's really in charge and you don't see on the screen, that's told, she's let me know that I can add a couple more questions. And maybe I'll go with one which is really open, but perhaps we can go around, which is, I mean, what do you see as the highest, or perhaps, one of the biggest barriers to healthy city development? What are the barriers that you're facing when you're trying to implement some of these changes, some of that vision? And I'll see who unmutes first, or I'll call on someone. Nisha.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I mean, honestly, I think a big part of it is conflicting incentives. When you have, our cities are just such complex, it's a complex nexus of so many different actors. You have government, you have private sector, you have public sector, you have academia, and they're all incentivized in different ways. And so it's very difficult to find solutions that actually kind of marry these incentives. At the core, the incentive of a government official is to, be reelected. And so therefore it's public perception and the votes that she's going to get in the next election. For a company, for a business, it's profit. For an academic institution, for a nonprofits, they're very different. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be identifying solutions that either kind of bring all those incentives together, or just completely rethinking how we want to be incentivizing some of these actors.
Jonathan.
I think that's, I agree. And I think if there's one thing I saw in practice before teaching, it was how important visions can be to bring consensus together. I'm not saying it always works, but I think if there's one thing I get excited about architects and my students doing, it's the fact that maybe they are the ones that can produce visions that can hopefully bring consensus together. And so I think what I've seen is these warring factions come together and get excited about a shared vision. And that's one thing I do get excited about, and I think that's where there's a role for envisioning. But I completely agree that the multiple parties and the conflicting incentives is a big challenge.
I mean, I think
Maya.
building on that, I would, but maybe turning in also a different direction, is the idea of really valuing both the physical and the invisible that's happening within cities. And so that could be, like, from my angle, it's about the kind of digital components, but it's also really important just in terms of assessing the health of the city. Things like, mental health, for example, which may not actually have a clear physical footprint, at least not all the time. And really kind of recognizing that we can't just rely on the things that are easily spotted and or easily measured when we evaluate the health of the city, but we have to kind of uncover richer techniques to see and pay attention to what's harder to get at.
I would only add to that, I think one of the limiting factors often is convention, the way we've always done things before, the fact that we use XPS rigid insulation in our well assemblies to improve building performance, but at a detrimental cost to the environment in terms of the petroleum products that are input into them. So I think I would say the other part that sometimes it may be visible, but we don't consider challenging, are these kinds of conventions. And I think the idea of visioning, how do we imagine totally alternate realities or alternate futures, is an important tool in sort of overcoming the sense of, well, that's how we've always done it. And we need to kind of dismantle those ideas.
No, thank you. I think there's a lot of, I feel like there's enough questions to fill another hour, but at the same time, I don't want to assume that everyone has a lot more time. And maybe we just plan another one of those sessions where we can continue the conversation. But and in fact, in your answers, you've also touched on like this issues of, the invisible that we don't often pay attention to. Like mental health was one of the questions that was brought. I mean, homelessness is another one. Accessibility, like there's so much when we start to talk about equity. and that, you know, the health of the city doesn't go without actually like paying attention to all of these, and how do we start to do this in a way that also acknowledges that there's only, I mean, we're also participants, you know, like we don't go in and control. I think there's both an acknowledgement of, I think there's a term that Hartmut Rosa, who I actually like as a sort of social reader, he talks about the uncontrollability of the world. And, you know, this, and then I think that part of that is staying with the trouble. So that's on the one hand, but I think all of your questions, you know, this sort of conflict answers, like conflicting incentives, or this need for a vision and a common visioning, but also paying attention to as much as what is visible to what is not as visible. And then, you know, not just focusing on what we can see, but always understanding what lies outside of our field of vision, and trying to uncover that as well, and challenging our own conventions, you know, like, or our own zones of comfort of what we know. But yeah, and I think ultimately understanding that all of this will, I think, only come through with awareness of codependence, complementarity, and then as a collective moving through this. I think I'll wrap it up, and I just want to thank you all for your answers and presence today, for the work that you're doing, for opening up, I think, more questions as well. I also want to thank everyone who joined for the conversation, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to everyone's questions. I have also to let you know that there are future sessions that will be, you know, that are part of the Alumni Speaker Series. The next one is on April 29th, and it's entitled Everything You Wanted to Know About 5G But Were Afraid to Ask. And there will be an email that you'll receive to invite you to register to those as well. And then there will also be, as I mentioned, a link to today's session that you can watch on YouTube or share with your friends. Okay, on that, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone in the background as well, who made this session happen pretty, you know, seamlessly. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank
To
you.
everyone. Thank you, Anne.